Hi, I think we're live. Welcome to this grand piano event at Kelly Writer's House. The title of this event is The Grand Piano 10 Years After, and I'd like to welcome everyone virtually to the University of Pennsylvania and to Kelly Writer's House. I'm Simone White. I teach here at the Kelly Writer's House, and my role here today is to introduce this incredibly rich and multiple conversation among, I think, all the authors, the original authors of the Grand Piano here this evening. So we have with us Rae Armantrout, Steve Benson, Carla Harryman, Lyn Hejinian, Tom Mandel, Ted Pearson, Bob Perelman, Kit Robinson, Ron Silliman, and Barrett Watten. We will have tonight 4 5-minute presentations by 6 presenters. Lyn Hejinian and Carla Harryman will begin, and we will roll forward for about 20 minutes with presentations from grand piano authors. I'm not going to belabor or try to restate the incredible introduction that these folks have written for this event for themselves, but I am going to give a brief bio for everyone before we get started, just to remind you all of how very accomplished everyone here tonight is. Rae Armantrout is the author of 7 books of poetry, including Wobble, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in 2018. Steve Benson's books include a collaboration with Suzanne Stein, Do Your Own Damn Laundry from Gauss PDF 2019, a collaboration with the Splatter Trio that includes a CD recording, It's a Stool Pigeon Universe from Rastakhan Records 2021, and his self-published poem series, As It Happens. Carla Harryman is the author of, most recently, Cloud Cantata, that's this year, and many other books. Her works have been performed nationally and internationally and include occupying Theodore Adorno's Music and New Music, a re-performance. Lyn Hejinian is the author of over 25 volumes of poetry and critical prose. This is going to take longer than any other presentation because so much has occurred. But Lyn is the author of over 25 volumes of poetry and critical prose, most recently Tribunal and Positions of the Sun. Allegorical Moments, Call to the Everyday, a volume of essays, is due out next year from Wesleyan, and The Proposition, an edition of early uncollected work, is forthcoming from the University of Edinburgh Press. Tom Mandel's work since 2010 includes Some Appearances, Epigrams of Pilatus, Letter to Poetry, and Simple Syrup. In addition to his career as a poet, Mandel was a technology entrepreneur for more than 2 decades. Ted Pearson published 12 volumes since 2010. That's a lot of books, including Extant Glyphs and Intermittent Music, The Coffin Nail, After Hours, The Markov Chain, Trace Elements, Personal Effects, Exit Music, Last Date, Set Pieces, and Early Autumn. Bob Perelman's works since 2010 include a collection of critical essays, Modernism, The Morning After, and New Poetry, Jack and Jill and Troy. Kit Robinson is the author of The Messianic Trees, Selected Poems 1976 to 2003. Determination, A Mammal of Style with Ted Greenwald, Marine Layer, Leaves of Class, Thought Balloon, and Quarantina. Ron Silliman, this is just in case, I don't know, you want to Google and find a book tonight. Ron Silliman left the tech industry after 22 years in 2011. Since then, he has published 11 books of poetry, including translations into Finnish, French, Italian, and Spanish. He is a standing lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania, where he received the Beltran Family Award for Innovative Teaching and has been a Kelly Writer's House Fellow. Barrett Watten has published sections of several long poems since the Grand Piano: Zone, Blue States, Plan B, Meridian is Archive, and Notzite, collected in the forthcoming Zone from Chax Press. Wesleyan University brought out with a guide to Poetics Journal, Writing in the Expanded Field, and Poetics Journal Digital Archive, co-edited with Lyn Hejinian. Key critical essays after 2000 appear in questions of poetics. And this panel or conversation will be moderated by Benjamin Lee from the University of Tennessee, who's the author of Poetics of Emergence, Affect in History and Post-War Experimental Poetry. So I'm going to hand this over immediately to Lyn and Carla to begin, and let you know that after these presentations, we'll have 10 minutes of sort of a volley between those GP authors who wish to contribute and respond, and then we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes of audience questions. You'll send those questions in through the chat, and I will pose those to the conversants tonight. So welcome again, and enjoy this. I can't wait to see what happens, actually.
You're muted, Lyn.
Lyn, can you unmute?
Sorry, now I'm live. Limit yourself to your memoirs. Identity is only natural. Now become the person in your life. Start writing autobiography. Thus ends Barrett Watten's 11-line poem, Mode Z. Do those lines throw up a challenge, give a command? Are they sarcastic, parodic, sincere? Who is the you to whom the pronoun your refers? Who am I? Who are we, the 10 authors of the grand piano? What is it that one is autobiographical about? And are the 10 works in the 10 volumes of the grand piano works of autobiography or theory?
Mode Z is a statement exuberance on the verge of negations. I was compelled to break some rules of discursive composition to state how I would characterize its lines. That compulsion is a through line between then and now. Identity, nature, only, memoir are removed from their commonplace and relocated in the non-site of a poem, each statement of which is close in meaning. The writing subject does not state itself, yet is sensed in the tonal excess that happens, especially in the whole poem. I think the GP autobiography is a conversation in poetics rather than theory. Some of the frames may be theoretical, the ontological, materiality, the psychoanalytic, theories of language, everyday life, aesthetics, and gender. Except in its larger frames, one cannot narrate this autobiography, so full of stories, interpretations, statements, and evocations of time, place, and history.
As history, the grand piano volumes are diagnostic, and that diagnosis is accompanied by a prognosis, a sense that all the engagements and projects, linguistic and or social, were contributing to a future. I never doubted that language writing would have repercussions far into whatever future human writing might have. I wrote my contributions because I felt compelled to do so, out of obligation to the then of which we were writing, 1975 to 1980, the then in which we were doing so, 2006 to 2012, and some prospective then, which now might be this moment, but which I prefer to imagine as a future yet to come and yet to be imagined.
Granting the multi-authorial we its singularities, I wanted to intervene in narratives out there, but also to find a different way to come upon the generative and troubling past in ways that could not be known until the essay would take flight. The conversation about what to focus on when that happened was always in a context that something could be decided differently. I think this is, for me, an aspect of the poetics that maps the autobiographical onto language writing as an emergent mode then.
The writing of autobiographies is part of an historical as well as literary tradition. And as Hans-Georg Gadamer has said, quote, tradition means transmission rather than conservation, end quote. I would argue that the writing of autobiography is an act of transmission that is meant to contribute to subjectivities, both present and future. The I of an autobiography is a momentary point of contact. The we that is generated by the autobiographical as it occurs in the grand piano provides multiple simultaneous points of contact, radically reconstituting the limited conscious subjectivity that is at the center of traditional single-authored autobiographies. We have called the grand piano a, quote, collective autobiography, end quote, but it could also be called a comparative autobiography with multiple trajectories propelled by an ongoing sense of history. Historiography becomes poetics.
The quote from Gadamer is a lot to chew, especially if one wants to take critical view of transmission and tradition. These are things I would want to test, work with, and against. In fact, I am currently writing on poetics as conversation. If that is an extension of the work on the grand piano, it is related to my curiosity about the construction of authorship.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Tom Mandel.
I'm
Unmute,
unmuted.
Tom.
I have. Can you hear me? I'm going to talk for a few minutes about like-mindedness. The notion of like-mindedness admits of no precise definition. All the same, it is useful in considering a literary movement like language poetry. I'll address it from a few different angles, and you will no doubt think of others. Probably my goal, or better still, my reason for that's the notion pretty widely shared, or assumed, a better word, that a movement in poetry, in this case, ours, should be understood as an group with a vector, perhaps even identity. That it might be usefully described as, for example, a collective, as for some reason the 10 authors of the GP are described in the description of tonight's event as a collective. This is, as some of you no doubt recognize, the Platonic idea of like-mindedness, homonoia, which ought to characterize a polis, if it is to become a kali polis, a work well. Members of such a political community ought to be in close agreement concerning the substance of their political association. I mentioned this idea of like-mindedness in order to dispel it, in favor perhaps to detour for a moment of the quite beautiful notion of a free multitude proposed in Spinoza's political treatise. Yet it seems unlikely that I'll get to politics in this little text, so let's move on. In the case of Langpo, there was neither a single doctrine nor even a shared overall goal that brought the movement to provide a substantive basis. Above all, there neither was nor could be a litmus test of any kind, a way to determine what was really and truly language poetry, whether one or another poet was really and truly a language poet. Instead, another sense of like-mindedness prevailed, and still does, as the 10 volumes of the Grand Piano attest, that emerged from what is sometimes called a virtuous cycle, a complex chain of events that reinforces itself through iterated positive feedback loops with beneficial, or let's say productive, results. There is no inherent tendency towards equilibrium in a virtuous cycle. Each iteration enhances the significance of the previous one. And I think you can see that in the multiple volumes of the Grand Piano. and provides multiple bases for a next iteration. One might characterize such events as poetic empathies that would sometimes or often render some number of us interested in or compelled by one another's works in ways that would register as a stimulant to further work along such or similar or different lines. In this way, whatever it is that gets characterized as a school or a movement may be understood as a set of emergent phenomena, above all, and I noted, by the way, that Ben writes about emergent poetics, above all, a set that always exceeds the analytical frameworks developed as tools used to understand or even characterize it as a movement. Thus, the poetry that defines a movement or a school always exceeds the poetics employed to frame it as a definition, or even to raise such a question. And above all, the latter ought not to be confused with the former, nor thought of as its basis. Nor is this to be taken as a critique of the intellectual flow of poetics, but rather as a recognition that this is a different discourse, which can only grow at a distance, sometimes small, sometimes considerable, from the unfolding over time of an always open set of poetic works. Once so understood, the notion of like-mindedness becomes rich indeed and scalable in multiple dimensions, i.e. scalable down to various personal or social empathies, which very definitely characterized our group, but also scalable up by way of chains of expression that exert influence both on the plane of our works and their creation, and incalculably on any possible plane going forward. Here we might turn to Bakhtin and mention his idea of meaning as inherently inexhaustible, productive at every step of meanings as yet undisclosed. But I'm out of time. So I'll conclude by doing what I said I wouldn't do. I'll revisit Spinoza for a moment. It's from the various always multiplying domains of like-mindedness that we see develop what he calls a free multitude, which I would see as a better characterization or a characterization than any other. And may it be so always. Thank you. Will you mute me or shall I mute myself? I'll mute myself.
Well, thanks, Tom. I mean, that brings us right into the whole idea of a kind of pre-digital poetics in language writing. Kit was talking about that in one of his sections at the last, at his own reading. And it turns out about half the number of people in the grand piano ended up doing something significant in the cyber world. And there are a lot of really interesting terms that pop out: emergence, like-mindedness, free multitudes. I'm seeing Deleuze and Guattari somewhere in there. This is my contribution. The grand piano 10 years after. There's a problem with meaning. It's only getting worse. How can a reflection among 10 authors of the grand piano, 10 years after concluding its publication in 10 volumes, 6 to 10 years in the making, concerning 6 years of a decade, 2 decades past, help in the present? When language writing emerged, it was a radical critique, an attack even, on the processes of making meaning that we experienced in the distorted present. The rationalizations of the Vietnam War in the 60s and the destruction of anything like a believable public sphere with the Reagan era in the 80s were proximate motives for our radicalization. We were the agonized middle of that history in the 70s. At its moment of intensest realization about 1978 or 80, many of us achieved a form of writing that reduced the problem of meaning to the bare matter of the sign, the material text, language as poetic substance. The question then was interpretation. What does the turn to language mean if language itself is put forward as an end to itself? I'll propose that a kind of short circuit resulted. between intention and meaning on the author's side and interpretation and meaning on the reader's. The inadequate popular solution for this dilemma was the reader makes meaning, opening the door toward a radical openness of meaning as well as form, the inheritance of the new Americans. My claim is first that language writing continued a prior ethics and aesthetics of open form by other means through material signification or fluidity and indeterminacy of meaning. And that actually recalls Lyn's essay, the rejection of closure. She says precisely that the rejection of closure really is happening at the moment of signification. That's where closure isn't. It can't happen. Second, our recasting of open form continues in the serial, open, non-narrative structure of the grand piano. There are significant moves between each of these moments, but in the larger horizon, our project was designed implicitly to make new meanings into the distant present. That distant present is here and now. Could we have anticipated it? This is not simply a matter of retrospective reflection, the tidying up and revision of all that indeterminacy into a kind of destiny. In a prescient moment of our early work, Kit Robinson explored reading out, and that's a technical term now I'm going to introduce, just like emergence, reading out in a 1974 poem written after the future grand pianist Steve Benson and Carla Harryman. He visited future grand pianist Steve Benson and Carla Harryman in Los Angeles. So this is 1974. We hardly knew what was going to happen next. And I'm quoting, reading from Kit. 7 days in another town. Mesopotamian wind blows the same way twice. Forever. 2 bullet holes. One in the window, one in the arm. Something isn't happening or isn't going to. Then sun, the wedge. Writing on his return to San Francisco, Kit explained this parable of Los Angeles through a series of glosses. He filled a page of them, but this is just one paragraph of them. Quote, like I said, the bullet hole in the window was really made by a pebble Larry threw up there to engage the attention of Rene Ricard, who was talking on the phone. The force of the wind drove it through. The one in the arm is from another of Chris Burden's stunts. He had himself shot in the arm as a performance piece. This condensed gloss of LA glam art culture mimics Ezra Pound's Dichten equals condensare. But the reading is in reverse, condensare to expansion, centripetal out of centrifugal. A project of autobiographical reading out from the material sign continued in our group with Ron Silliman's Ketchak and Lyn Hejinian's My Life. I investigated the prose poetry dyad, beginning with the sign and heading towards the prose interpretation, in my 1980 sequence 1 to 10, anticipating the decades motif of the grand piano. Later, Ron explored reading outs in his parallel text for Albany, while Steve Benson and Ted Pearson enact a continuous form of reading out, with the important corollary that any work of import written by any of us might have been written by any other of us. We were primed to write Leningrad, Bad History, Adorno's Noise, the Grand Piano, and our works. Kit's poem was an event of meaning, with meanings yet to come. So I'll just say that when he wrote this poem, there was a kind of aesthetics of the name. This is derived from the New York school, Ted Berrigan and so forth. But Steve and Carla weren't names yet in that sense, but Rene Ricard was. And Rene Ricard was a glamorous figure with a name in that period. So Kit imports the glamorous name of Rene Ricard into the poem addressed to Steve and Carla. But in the future event of meaning, Steve and Carla become persons of the poem. In fact, they become invoked by it. They begin to take part in it. They become authors, pianists, and part of our collective project. So back in the day, or there's a kind of notion that language writing started with this material signification. And then when we did the grand piano, we decided to go prose and narrative and story and reception and all that. Actually, right there from the very beginning, the two things were joined at the hip. That was an event.
I'm Steve Benson. I'm writing on writing as an intervention in time. The planning and composition and publication of the grand piano defied the usual deployment of artistic integrity and authority. Defied that. In the effort to observe deadlines and to read and critique and advise one another, many hours were devoted to refining the essays for each volume in turn. Our intended outcome of 10 volumes remained hypothetical year to year in the face of the potentials of mortality and accident, interpersonal conflicts, and flagging confidence and motivation, pressed to sustain what's pressed, the outcome, I guess, or no, the writers pressed to sustain and not betray the group's intentions in the context of a caring, reciprocal commitment. We felt each other's reciprocal, we were there for each other, committed to each other, held through the affectionate respect and astonishing creativity of 10 admired, beloved friends. We were obliged to bear in mind an extraordinary complexity of layers, including timeframes within the project, including our present reflections on it, and frameworks of contextualization relied on by readers and listeners. The work on the grand piano, our working on it, was a chance to make time. We made time for this work, and reciprocally, it made time for us. An unexpectedly expanding and diverse time across years, places, and persons. It came to break whatever implicit laws I might have experienced as time. The grand piano itself engages consciously in diverse and simultaneous implications of this engineering of consciousness in relation to time and to timelessness, orchestrating them among its many movements and variations into an outstandingly, absurdly ambitious symphony, subject to each reader's reframing as they read along. It could be we celebrate the past to evade the disturbing state of anticipating eventualities, perhaps dreadful, hopeless, utterly confusing, or startlingly welcome. Yet anyone's past is laced with toxic recollections and moral ambiguities. To psychoanalysis, we owe the idea that a human's unconscious is timeless. So I can attribute the recognition and qualities of time itself to the mysterious performances of consciousness. Consciousness, in effect, imposes the challenges of time upon us. including whether it exists or not, whether it is cyclical or sequential or both, or perhaps universally simultaneous. Writing faces consciousness with itself in the writer, who will in turn become the reader, and in any reader, consciously negotiating the time frame of any given text. The grand piano volumes open this existentially fraught process to personal reflection, free play, vicarious enjoyment, and self-education, while also stimulating a curiosity about its tacit engagement of both shared and individual subconscious throughout its Batcave explorations. In this way, we celebrate life.
I'm Ben Lee, and let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be included this evening as respondent and moderator. I'm lucky to have spent time with a few of the authors of the grand piano, others I just met moments ago. And yet in all cases, I feel like I've known them for years. I've spent so much time with the essays in the grand piano, with the poems referenced there, and with the recorded appearances of these authors housed on YouTube or on PennSound, that their voices are familiar to me. They've long helped me think about poetry and poetics, what it is, what it was, what it can be, what it might become. I know it's their voices and their thinking about poetry and poetics that you want to hear now. And so I'll limit my remarks as respondent to just 3 points before I turn to my role as moderator in inviting the grand piano authors to respond to one another before inviting questions and comments from the audience. First, and I don't think we can emphasize this strongly enough, the grand piano is a collective autobiography, a significant expansion of the genre of life writing, replacing assumptions about individual authorship with meditations on the author and language itself as socially situated and multiply produced. Autobiography becomes decidedly less solitary and more like a set of improvisations carried out in real time and in relation to others. The Lyn Hejinian, Carla Harryman dialogue we just heard is yet one more example of this, and of all these authors' commitments to writing and thinking collaboratively in a way that makes visible sudden detours and disagreements. There is no single instantiation of language poetry, as Tom Mandel reminds us, but rather a series of often very different texts that have been described that way, and a discussion not yet concluded about why we call something language poetry. Second, I invite you to think again, as all our presenters already have, of the grand piano as a model of complex and self-conscious historicism. At the moment I first began to read the grand piano, critiques of periodization, of flat or oversimplified versions of literary history were common. Context critics like Rita Felsky complained, too often, quote, gets handled like a box, end quote. In studies of a given historical period, quote, a kind of context becomes, quote, a kind of historical container in which individual texts are encased and held fast, end quote. The grand piano seemed to anticipate and respond to such critiques, treating the 1970s not as a box or container, but rather as a spur to further historical thinking. Quote, we were obliged to bear in mind an extraordinary complexity of layers, as Steve Benson has just reminded us, quote, including timeframes within the project, including our present reflections on it, and the frameworks of contextualization relied on by readers and listeners, end quote. Or, as Barrett Watten puts it, quote, how can a reflection among 10 authors of the grand piano 10 years after concluding its publication in 10 volumes, 6 to 10 years in the making, concerning 6 years of a decade, i.e. the 1970s, 2 decades past, help in the present, end quote. Finally, I want to call your attention to the list of publications by these 10 authors listed on the Kelly Writers House page as part of publicity for this event, and Simone mentioned many of those at the outset. These are books, CDs, translations, operas, essays, performances, and collaborations that have appeared since the final volume of the Grand Piano in 2010. Together, they speak of a group of authors who, though the accolades and influence they have achieved is richly deserved, never seem to write for accolades, but rather for the challenges they discovered in the work itself and for the community it created for them. Ted Pearson, in a recent episode of Grand Piano TV, calls this, quote, a community of practice, end quote, which he defines as, quote, a group of people who share a concern or passion with something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly, end quote. One is dazzled by the collective work these authors have produced, but even more dazzled by the ongoing commitment they represent to writing and thinking together with and in relation to others. So I'll end my remarks there and first ask the grand pianists to respond to one another and to think back on the grand piano 10 years after, as it were. Someone, Kit, your hand is up.
I love that. So.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks for explaining how to raise my hand earlier on. I want to just make a couple comments on the poem that I wrote and that Barry talked about in his piece, 7 Days in Another Town, which, as he said, alternates between poetry and prose. The first thing I thought to mention was just that there are plenty of models for this in history, beginning, I guess Dante's La Vita Nuova would be an example. The Narrow Road to the North by Basho, using the Japanese haibun, in which a narrative is speckled with haiku, and Williams's Spring and All. But what I mainly wanted to mention is something about the reception of that poem. When I was doing poetry in the schools in the late 70s and early 80s, I used this as a model for in-class writing exercises. And the direction was, think about a place that you visited and put down some details in verse form without explaining what they are. And then write some prose that provides a context, narrative, to place those things. And it was a really effective assignment. I got a lot of great writing from students, and they loved it. They just jumped right on it. There's one line in particular that I remember from that time. I think it was 1982 at Montera Middle School in Oakland. It was a girl who had spent some, well, I'll give you the line first. The line was, "Our sweat cools us down." And in the prose, we learned that she and her family had spent some time in the Middle East. I think it was in Bahrain. And she had encountered some men in the street who were wearing robes. And she asked them, how can you wear those robes? Aren't you hot?
Well, in your poem, there's that one word, forever, and it's in quotes. The word could not have been in quotes. Putting it in quotes, is it a tattoo? Is it a tombstone? Any number of ways that it could be in a context, and yet the context is withheld. And the quote marks are there to signify that. So, we get into this kind of, I think a thread here has been historicism and the avoidance of periodization or avoidance of containment. We might even call it microhistoricism, microhistories, microhistoricism. And on the other hand, I just was visiting Modernist Studies Association, and there was some pushback around historicism, periodizing, and so forth. And I think modernism has always conveyed a certain kind of release from that in abstract art, and to some extent, the turn to language was seen as a release from historicism. So one of the questions, there's a decidability question here about which way does it flip? And that leads to decidability. And so these contexts or non-contexts, and I think it's always possible to say they're non-context, like forever could not refer to any context. It could just be forever with quotes around it. And maybe forevermore it will be that. So that opens up the question of decision-making. And it's something that we did a lot of in writing. We made decisions, and they were decisions about whether to bring something in, leave something out, react. I'll turn it over to others.
Well, I'd like to note that the quotation marks around forever, like quotation marks in many situations, although not the so-called scare quotes when you are calling attention to the dubious credibility or verity of what's being quoted. But apart from those, one can either read into the quoted material, that is, like figure out like what's being meant, what's being said, or to use your term, Barrett, to read out from it. And it seems to me that, again, the question of decidability as a reader, you're going to, first you're going to decide what kind of reader you are. Are you reading for the narrative and you are going to read into this the nefarious purposes of the loathsome creep that is trying to seduce the owner of the poodle to surrender the jewels, etc.? Or are you going to read out from it and like think about contexts in which such loathsome creeps exist, and etc.? I mean, I'm just making this up as I go, but it seems like
keep at it.
Yeah, the openness here, it to me has always been the preferable option to take. And in terms of choreography, or yeah,
the dog has agency too, Lynn.
Yeah.
Don't forget that.
Zephyr has a comment. That we can think of history as a box, like the Napoleonic Wars or the French Revolution, but we can also unbox it and think of those as contexts from which things jump. Like we're still living in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars or the French Revolution, or the aftermath of the aftermath of the aftermath of the aftermath of those things, which seems to me like a very productive and generative way to think about history. And now I'll shut up.
And certainly in the aftermath of the 1970s, I wonder if Rae or Ron or Bob, who didn't have a chance to present, wanted to weigh in and respond.
Or Ted. I think Ted's got.
Ted too, correct.
I had an interest in one thread that ran through the presentations we just heard earlier. And that thread has more or less explicitly to do with our relationship to the future. So I would ask of the presenters and of the rest of the pianists these kinds of questions, which are, I suppose, the legacy questions. What is your legacy as a writer? How has your association with language writing influenced that legacy? What future did you address in your essay in volume 10? And what future do you now envision for the project going forward? Anybody who wants it?
Well, I can take a stab at one little piece of that. And that is that one of the, as we went along writing the grand piano, one of the subjects that we talked about, sort of meta subject, was all the people that were not writing the grand piano who might well have been participating in the project. And you know, we could name, it would be easy to name many of them. But so in volume 10, I invented a non-existent poet to stand in for them, a woman named B. Hookery, first name Bea. And that was the best way I could think of to concretely bring someone other than myself or my peers, my collaborators, into the project. And in doing it, I allowed her, well, she argued with me quite a bit. Anyway, that's what I can say about that right off. So that's autobiography as outside the frame, let's say.
Oh, there's Carla.
You're muted, Carla.
The puppy mute. So just very quickly, my contribution to 10 was elegiac. It brought in Kathy Acker, Lorenzo Thomas, Philip Horvitz, who was a performance artist in San Francisco, and the museum director, James Elliott. So I wasn't thinking about the future. I was thinking about the impress of people on life and writing, and using that as a way to create actually fabricate a memory and a concept of those figures that was open and minimal in certain ways, to, you know, leave space for what couldn't be said. So that's my little comment before I leave. Thanks.
Cool.
I'm thinking of the postmodern moment of the end of Blade Runner and Rutger Hauer's, you know, incredible speech, like Tears and Rain. And then, of course, Blade Runner raises that to a moment that, you know, keeps generating itself. But this is, speaking of the elegy, early on, this is Bob Grenier's box, which is 500 index cards. It used to have ivory clasps on it. And even at the time, it seemed like a little tomb, you know, more pointedly so than even the literary tradition of the elegy could permit. What could you say about that? You know, about that aspect of it? I think it's an hysterically funny joke, but it also certainly was so radical in its gesture that it maintained a kind of presencing. It kept on generating its own moment. And I think that's true in any record of the temporality of our lives, that, you know, what we're doing is we're inscribing something that we don't want to be like Tears and Rain, although that moment is inscribed. And that brought me to this marvelous moment in Carla and Lyn's discussion, where Lyn talks about the eye of an autobiography as a momentary point of contact for the reader, I assume. So whenever there's an autobiography, you enter into the eye of the writer, who's other to you, but in a way that establishes a bond for the time of writing the autobiography. And well, I think that bond is what gets explored then in the dialogue between you and Carla. So it's an expansion of that principle of inscription. So I'll leave that.
I saw Rae had her hand up, and I can tell Ron has something to tell us as well.
Yeah.
I was just going to try to answer the question about seeing the future, trying to write the future in the 10th essay. And I wasn't trying to do that. I'm never trying to write the future. I don't know why, but I'm not. I should, but anyway. But that essay sort of turned into a poem, for me, a longish poem called Autobiography, Earned Burial. And that had lots of almost parody in it, because I was dealing with what tone, of what writerly voice to use in narrating the facts as I remembered them of my life and of our lives. And it kept sliding into, thinking about masterpiece theater, thinking about, English literature, thinking about just all the ways that this has been done. And then, trying to hit that mark or that tone for a bit, which was fun. A kind of a deflection, but also a bringing of self-consciousness, I guess, to the fact that not only is there always an I, but in autobiography, but the I has to be constructed, and this is too obvious, right? Why did I start down this path? But it has to be constructed, however ersatz, from, or at least with an awareness of all the ways it's been constructed before. So that's what my number 10 was doing. So if I'm ever going to write about the future, it'll have to be in the future.
I want to give Ron and Bob a chance to respond.
Right. This is one of Bob Grenier's scroll works, which I just literally pulled off my wall. It's one of two, so that it actually creates sort of a theme in this room. And it reminded me of all the forms of in-betweenness that all of us had, and many of our friends and peers. I remember Donald Byrd, who actually I hope is watching this, once tell me that he couldn't imagine submitting a box of poems to the English department at SUNY Albany when they were considering the possibility of an opening that Bob certainly did want, as Bob tried for many an academic job, only to try to lose them the instant they were obtained. But that box was both a great challenge, and my ivory things have dissolved into history as well. That's, I think, a common phenomenon of that box. And it stood for me, thinking about that, as a figure for a phenomenon that I see actually more clearly in this particular format than I have in the grand piano TV formats, where the Zoom screen has 60 or so other people beyond the 10 authors for any given event. And we sort of become part of the field of viewers in those terms, to see so many of us on a single screen, see all of us on a single screen, is a very powerful emotional experience here in Pennsylvania. And I'm conscious of the way in which everything we did as the grand piano was also a kernel towards many, many other friends and colleagues and people who we don't necessarily think of as colleagues. For example, David Highsmith and Carl Loeffler were the people who led me to Ted Pearson. But they also led me to my own critical writing. I was describing what would later become Disappearance of the Word, Appearance of the World, as just an idea to them. Well, they were telling me that there was this great poet from down the peninsula who I had to go check out. And, fruitful discussions in both directions. And yet I don't write or talk of Carl, who's long since passed, became a serious major curator before he did, and David, who's still around San Francisco, or the fact that my mother was best friends with the next door neighbor of, and I might have this slightly wrong, Barry, your aunt. We discovered this at some point going on. My original connection to Barry way predates this magazine or Toddles. And in fact, we had lost touch with one another until I discovered him in Bob Grenier's office at Berkeley one day, where he was visiting from Iowa City, a place I could never imagine going to school, because I generally kept getting like an allergic reaction every time I thought about, Marvin Bell and the other options of what was there. So there are 10 of us, but beyond the 10, it's almost like the Kevin Bacon game in reverse. Beyond the 10 of us, there are 100 of us, and beyond 100 of us, there are 1,000 of us. And you can't really discuss almost any single moment in that distant past without in some way positioning or invoking all of what you know about all of those people and what they mean to you and what they meant to each other, and those who are still here, those who have gone on. The same is probably true in the future. I've often thought that a really interesting discussion that's never been had would be on what the death of Charles Olson in 1970, which is memorialized by Elsa Dorfman in the first volume of this, really meant in terms of the reception that the early editions of that magazine received. And likewise, I really think that there's an interesting discussion to be had around what editing meant during this 20-year period after 1970 versus the period that sort of came from 1990 onward with writers younger than ourselves who seemed to be so militantly opposed to the idea of imposing a critical reading into a table of contents. Every single issue of this, every single issue of Poetics Journal read like an argument, a well-reasoned, deeply conceived discussion. And yet the writing of the next generation seemed very much disinterested in that, is probably the most charitable way I can put it.
Ron, when you do that, you're getting into the post-avant and in a kind of historical argument there. But there is the fact of generation, and generations are events, and you couldn't expect a generation following ours to necessarily have the same kind of what would you say, deep structure, let's say. And I think there is a deep structure to what you were just describing. So it's just to hang a little bit of a question on that.
Oh, I think you're entirely right. I mean, we had an experience of Vietnam entirely unlike theirs. So
I just want to say briefly that, there's got to be antagonism between generations is, I think, more the norm than sequential development. And I think that also is going to structure it's not even much of an answer, but my reaction to Ted's question about the future is, I don't think we have much say in it, actually. And I think we all plan to keep writing, and I certainly, and here I'm just, I guess, speaking for myself, but I'm positive, I'm echoing the feelings of a lot of everybody else here, that the grand piano is a chapter in our various careers, and we're continuing to write and to push against what has been done, and the desire to still do, to address really the present, in my case, I suppose, with with an adequacy that it never feels like it's enough. So.
Well said.
Well said. I don't think they're going to kick us on Zoom, but I do think the Kelly Writers House is looking to end close to 7. So we've gotten to our hour. So I wonder if there are any. I wonder if there are future events, grand piano events that we need to mention briefly, or if Simone wants to come on before we depart to talk about future Kelly Writers House events.
Hi, I'm coming on, but I'm coming on to ask for audience questions. We have a few that are already being sent over from YouTube. So why don't I begin with those? We'll take a few minutes, and I hope that everybody can hear me as I ask these questions. So the first question is from Matt L. And this is, I'm reading directly from the chat. What are some of the ways by which members of this group contributed to one another's apprenticeship in poetry? And the second part of this comment is, as a poet who's figuring his way, I'm finding my relationships with other poets and artists, relationships that are largely virtual, indispensable. Apprenticeships.
Since I haven't said much, let me just jump in quickly to say, I think that it was completely crucial in our youths that we paid a tremendous amount of attention to each other, often in admiration and antagonism, in envy, in collaboration. Totally crucial.
I remember a moment when I either showed Bob a poem or had submitted it to Hills. But I remember we were walking the whole scenario, and I asked him about one section of it, and I had a terrible line in it, which was, "Is the sunset art?" Which terrible.
I sort of remember that.
and Bob looked at it and he said, "That's an idiotic question. Why would you ask that?" I was like immediately embarrassed. I immediately saw what absurdity, or I won't even dignify it with the term absurdity as an art term, like sheer blather it was. So there was like a beneficial negatives. It's like Rae at her GPTV presentation included discussion of what she perceived, I think accurately, as a kind of violence of judgment that was an ongoing part of the conversational milieu of the scene around what I will loosely call the grand piano, which is the actually very broad, extended interrelationships between poets and poetry readers, filmmakers, painters, musicians, etc. That was ongoing. Yeah, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but anyway, yeah, there was like this sort of.
If the violence of judgment is productive and useful
really
when you trust, when you trust people and you feel safe, basically.
Yeah.
So.
And in a way, the way it was then for us, I think is, well, this is just the good old days are better than is better than the kind of milk toasty, say nothing negative, always praise culture that's replaced it. At least, I mean, I guess I don't know about every culture, obviously, but online, every poem is stupendous and gorgeous and stunning. And I just keep thinking, wait till you're really stunned by something. Like there are some stunning things that happen, but these poems are probably not among them, So I just refuse to use any of that language. But yeah, I think it was healthy to be able to check one another. And I have a story about hills too. One time, Chuck and I were walking around, I can't remember why, in the financial district. We were going to go get a drink, fun day. But nonetheless, I stopped at a payphone and called Bob to see what he thought about the poem that I had submitted to Hills.
Not the first time for that, I don't think. Or the last.
Right. You've replaced us with instant messaging.
Yeah.
There's a spontaneity to that, which is, when I think about apprenticeship, I think about time in college when Kit and I and Michael Waltuck and David Wilk developed a magazine together that published our work and our friends' work. And that there was a lot of that going on. There was a lot of spontaneous, quick publication that could circulate easily for no money. And that was very rich and wonderful to be part of, even though, it was all just Xeroxes and mimeograph.
Well, this might actually be a good segue into this question from Henry Finch, who says, hello from Germany. How does the increasing integration of technology into individual writing impact participation, expression in a collective? How does technology impact or influence our poetic autonomy?
I have an answer, and then unfortunately I have to leave actually. But can you hear me?
Yeah.
There is a little bit of a conflict among us about whose idea it was to do the grand piano, and I'm firmly convinced that it was my idea, and that it was because I had this software that I had a little company that I had started that had developed the software that was designed to do social stuff on the web. This is mid-90s. When we started doing that. And I thought it would be great if we could use it to write this thing, and that it would be great to do that. On the other hand, Carla, I think, has a completely different version of this, in which she came up with the idea, and I'm sure others do as well. So that I think some of the reflection about history ought to at least be filtered through the fact that there's, no matter how you cut it, only the first person speaks, and yeah. Okay, so I fear, unfortunately, I have to bop. I've got something I have to go do. I thought this was scheduled for an hour. It was my mistake, I guess. Is that not the case?
It's not
Any question
it's called lateness. That's
Totally.
It's Ron.
poetry time.
And I just
Oh.
want to counter what Tom was saying, that I think the start of the grand piano secretly was a discussion that Barrett, Lyn, Michael Davidson, and I had at the LAX airport on just before we took a flight to Helsinki, and that our later collaboration, Leningrad, was a prototype that several of us were interested in seeing how much further that kind of interaction could go. So I date this actually
I will
back
just
to
say
the
before I
80s.
leave, this seems completely unlikely because I was not there.
Actually,
I remember you being there.
the origin of the grand piano was in the Brat Guts group, and I don't think anybody is going to deny
Oh,
this.
Okay, I gotta go. Bye,
And
guys.
it really was. It was the moment where three poets got together and they were doing these
Love you all, guys.
spontaneous compositions, and they wrote a line, instead of Antwort, I saw Brat Guts, and that the line had no individual attribution. And we wrote at length on this in the grand piano. So it's the possibility that that kind of collaborative process could create a poetic line that was not authored by anyone.
Actually, that was my line.
But everybody used it in their works, right? All three of you used it in their works at one point. And I
So
wasn't there.
as a concluding question, I'm just gonna, maybe one person will take this. What were some of the conversations around deciding on the grand piano as a title? I think it's a good thing to end on, and maybe just one person will take it.
Facticity. The reading series at the grand piano was an inescapable fact that everybody on the screen had at one point or another shepherded on Tuesday nights, I believe, in the Haight-Ashbury. It was the name of a coffee house, and it existed because the woman who owned the building could not get her grand piano upstairs, so she put it on the ground floor and opened a coffee house around it. And Tom once beat up the cook, but he's not
Just saying.
That's it. That's it.
Oh,
He doesn't remember.
there was a cat, a moment of a cat when Steve and Carla were performing Try by Frank O'Hara, and somebody from outside on the Haight-Ashbury opened the door into this crowded room with a performance going on and threw in a cat.
Well, with that, I can't imagine a better note on which to end. Thank you all for being here on YouTube with us this evening. Thank you, Kit and Barrett and Ben and Lyn and Steve and Rae and Ted and Bob and Ron, and of course, Carla and Tom, who's already gone. This is, I mean, I've got my little copies here, sort of thumbing through them, and I hope all of you do at home. This will continue to sort of layer after layer after layer, all these wonderful questions around time. I look forward to revisiting these many, many, many more times.
Bye.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks, Simone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ben.
Lovely to
Thank
be
you,
here.
Simone. Thank you, Zach.
Good night.
Thanks,
Thank
Simone.
you.
Thanks, Zach. Good to see everyone.